Hej och välkomna till Amerikanska nyhetsanalyser avsnitt 55. Jag heter Ronie Berggren och för er som inte har lyssnat förut så är det här podcasten som lyckas där svensk media misslyckas. I detta avsnitt tänkte jag prata om grunden för den moderna västvärldens värderingar utifrån den konservative brittiske EU-parlamentarikern Daniel Hannans bok från 2013. Inventing Freedom, How the English-speaking Peoples Made the Modern World. En bok i vilken Hannan förklarar att de värderingar som vi i Europa och i väst idag tar för givna, som mänskliga rättigheter och representativa demokratier, i själva verket är värderingar som härrör från England och som först efter andra världskriget fick fäste i större delar av Europa. Ett historiskt faktum de flesta i vår tid helt har glömt bort. Daniel Hannan är medlem i brittiska Tories, författare och EU-parlamentariker sedan 1999. Han bloggar också regelbundet på The Daily Telegraph och är såväl en anhängare av amerikansk konservatism som är kritiker till den Europeiska Unionen och vill se ett brittiskt EU-träde eftersom han anser att EU är en överstatlig, nationellt hämmande och ytterst bakåtsträvande kraft i Europa, i synnerhet i jämförelse med den brittiskt inspirerade Anglosfären. Häromdagen sa han följande på en frågestund efter ett tal vid Kirby Center på Hillsdale College i Washington DC.
I will be strongly campaigning to take Britain out of the European Union and to rejoin the wider family of free English-speaking democracies who have been our truest friends down the ages. The European Union has left us poorer, less democratic and less free.
För ett år sedan pratade jag i vårt 23:e poddavsnitt med Daniel Hannan om hans bok The New Road to Serfdom. Nu har jag pratat med honom igen om hans nya bok, en intervju ni strax ska få höra. Men först följer det här en liten introduktion till boken och till ämnet i fråga. Under det pågående amerikanska presidentvalet 2012 gjorde republikanernas presidentkandidat Mitt Romney under sommaren resa till England för att på så vis stärka sin utrikespolitiska profil. På väg dit citerades i brittiska Daily Telegraph en anonym rådgivare till Romney som sa att USA och Storbritannien var en del av ett och samma anglosaxiska arv. Uttrycket fick vänstern i såväl USA som Storbritannien att börja raljera om rasism och Obamas återvalskampanj kommenterade och sa att uttrycket var väldigt stötande. Väl på plats i London fick Romney en intervju av Brian Williams på NBC den 25 juli möjlighet att kommentera.
In the time you and I were both in the air flying here, the Daily Telegraph has run a story quoting a Romney advisor, and I want to get your reaction to this. We are part of an Anglo-Saxon heritage, and he feels that the special relationship is special, the advisor said of Mr. Romney, adding, the White House didn't fully appreciate the shared history we have. What's your reaction to this quote from an advisor of yours in the Daily Telegraph here in London?
Well, first of all, I'm generally not enthusiastic about adopting the comments made by people who are unnamed. I have a lot of advisors. Actually, we've gone from calling the rope line, where I shake hands every day, to the advice line, because you have a lot of people that offer advice. So I'm not sure who this person is. But I can tell you that we have a very special relationship between the United States and Great Britain. It goes back to our very beginnings, cultural and historical. But I also believe the president understands that. So I don't agree with whoever that advisor might be, but do agree that we have a very common bond between ourselves and Great Britain.
Romney betonade de historiska kopplingarna mellan Storbritannien och USA, men tog avstånd från termen anglosaxisk, en term som inte var politiskt korrekt, i synnerhet inte mitt uppe i en valkampanj. Daniel Hannan konstaterar dock i sin bok Inventing Freedom att den anglosaxiska historien inte har någonting med rastillhörighet att göra, utan med den specifika syn på förhållandet mellan medborgare och stat som växte fram i England för mer än 1000 år sedan och konkret tog sig uttryck i Magna Charta och senare skulle komma att prägla stora delar av den engelsktalande värld som härrör från det brittiska imperiet på ett mer naturligt sätt än det någonsin gjort i resten av Europa. Värderingar i Europa i dess helhet tog till sig så sent som först efter andra världskriget. Hannan skriver följande. Mellan de två världskrigen var fascism och kommunism de uppkommande idéerna och land efter land föll för eller tydde sig till det ena eller det andra. Antiparlamentariska krafter behövde inte förlita sig på kupper och invasioner. Från Portugal till Ryssland, från Tyskland till Grekland så hade auktoritära regeringar ett stort allmänt stöd. I Anglosfären som kontrast lyckades däremot inga fascistiska partier någonsin få ett enda mandat i ett nationellt parlament och framgångarna för den revolutionära vänstern var nästan lika förfärlig. I våras talade Daniel Hannan vid USAs konservativa SIPA-konferens och sa då följande om detta.
Think of the world as it stood in August 1941. Constitutional freedom was confined to the Anglosfere, to the community of free English-speaking peoples. The whole of the Eurasian landmass, from Seoul and Vladivostok to Brest and Lisbon, was under one form or another of authoritarianism. The easiest temptation to give in to, my friends, is to take things for granted, to become blasé about the unique privileges we've been born with. We can so easily fall into the error of assuming that freedom and free contract, that regular elections and uncensored newspapers, that jury trials and habeas corpus and equality between men and women, that these things are somehow the natural condition of an advanced society. That every country will get there when it becomes educated enough and wealthy enough. But history tells a very different story. Those precepts were overwhelmingly developed in the language in which you're listening to these words. We now tend to call them Western values. Sometimes we even call them universal values. But you know what? We're being polite. The reason they became Western values, if we're blunt about it, was as a direct result of a series of military victories by the English-speaking peoples. If the Second World War or the Cold War had ended differently, they would not be universal values today. They wouldn't even be universal aspirations today. Our fathers, yours and mine, not only defended freedom in their homelands, but took the promise of liberty across the oceans. And as a result, our species has been elevated to a pinnacle of wealth and freedom and happiness that was previously unimaginable.
På det kontinentala Europa råder en helt annan förståelse av historien. Där utgår man från att det var den franska revolutionen 1789 som satte Europas progressiva utveckling i rullning. Det var då Europa blev upplyst och demokratiorienterat och då man kastade av sig ett medeltida teokratisk kristendomsok. Efter andra världskriget, ett krig i vilket stora delar av det kontinentala Europa har väldigt mycket att skämmas för, skapades det som nu är den Europeiska Unionen. En union som aktivt driver mytbildningen att det är det europeiska integrationsprojektet som upprätthållit efterkrigsfreden i Europa. En myt som inte stämmer och som jag pratar mer ingående om i såväl podd 23 där Daniel Hannan intervjuas som i podd 26 där den brittiske historikern Kate Love intervjuas. Freden i Europa beror på att Storbritannien och USA och deras anglosfäriska allierade besegrade fascism och kommunism och sedan etablerade en världsordning baserad på sina egna frihetsideal med tro på individuell frihet och frihandel och idén om att staten var underställd individen, inte tvärtom. Huvudpersonen i kampen mot Europas totalitära ideologier och för upprättandet av efterkrigstidens anglosaxiska världsordning var förstås Storbritanniens premiärminister Winston Churchill, en person som emellertid ofta citeras av EU-anhängare på grund av att han i ett tal i Zürich 1946 pratar om behovet av att skapa ett Europas förenta stater, en fras som förstås helt spelar EU-anhängarnas federalister i händerna. I Folkpartiets valmanifest Europa i globaliseringens tid, liberala utmaningar inför 2020-talet citerar Folkpartiets EU-parlamentariker Cecilia Wikström orden från Churchill och skriver sedan att Churchills dröm ännu inte helt har gått i uppfyllelse eftersom EU fortfarande inte lyckats skapa någon bankunion eller någon gemensam asylpolitik. Därmed visar hon också att dagens liberaler är vår tids socialister, folk som vill väl men får det mesta fel. Hennes och många andra EU-förespråkares sätt att citera Winston Churchill är nämligen lika dålig som deras förståelse för europeisk historia och vad det verkligen är som gjort Europa till en progressiv och vettig kontinent. Och det är vare sig den franska revolutionen eller den Europeiska unionen. Något jag pratade mer ingående med Daniel Hannan om. Här är vårt samtal. With me now is Daniel Hannan, author of Inventing Freedom, How the English-Speaking Peoples Made a Modern World. Mr. Hannan, welcome back to my podcast.
It's always a pleasure.
When I grew up here in Sweden and read history in elementary school, we learned that the modern world began with the French Revolution in 1789. That was the year when Europe became enlightened and said no to the Christian theocracies of the Middle Ages. In your book, you tell a quite different story about how the things we now take for granted, such as democracy and human rights, actually began in England 100 years before the French Revolution. Could you please talk a little bit about that?
I think there's a real difference in the tradition between the continental one, which began, as you say, in 1789, and the Anglosphere tradition. And the difference has to do with the role of freedom and property. In the Anglo-Saxon tradition, which begins with the folk right of common law, something that, a variant of which existed in Scandinavian societies, that then passes through Magna Carta, passes through our glorious revolution. Parliamentary rule is seen as a guarantor of individual liberty and of free contract and property rights. The Jacobin tradition is a very different one. It sees a majority of 50% plus one as the last word. It allows for a majority to tyrannize a minority. And in practical terms, rather than just arguing the theory, we can see the difference in how it's worked out. In Anglosphere societies, throughout the 20th century, there was never any popular support for either communism or for fascism. A system where freedom was the responsibility of every citizen through voting for an MP rather than being contracted out to a Supreme Court made people much more tenacious in defense of their inherited rights. And so although I can understand on paper why it seems attractive to say we have these universal rights and they apply to everyone, in practice that system has been much more open to authoritarian government than has let's call it the more limited, more modest thing that says, here is a particular contractual right, and we can point to a particular moment in history where it was won by our ancestors.
Very interesting. One thing, you mentioned the British common law, but you also write about the Roman law. What is the difference between the British common law and the Roman law?
Well, it's actually English common law,
okay.
Although confusingly it applies in Ireland but not in Scotland.
Okay.
The bizarre thing about common law is that nobody wrote it down. It was discovered in stages. What you would expect to do if you were designing a legal system is you'd say, first of all, somebody writes down the law in the abstract, and then we apply it to a particular dispute. And that's what almost the whole of the rest of the world does. But there's about a third of the world's population, one way or another, that lives under common law. That's, basically British Commonwealth countries plus Israel, curiously enough. Yeah. And the common law, instead of a politician writing it down, each judgment serves as the starting point for the next dispute. It grows like a coral, case by case. It comes up from the people instead of coming down from the state. And this is important because it assumes residual liberty. And I see this difference every month where I work in the European Parliament. Very often when I talk to friends from other European countries, their starting point is that something needs to be licensed, something needs to be regulated so that it's put on a proper legal basis. Whereas, of course, our starting point is that lack of regulation is the natural condition, that unless you have a particular problem, there's no need for any laws at all. The common law is domesticated. It belongs to everyone. And in fact, that's a very practical thing. The obligation of jury service is something that everybody has. And this serves, again, to reinforce the idea that the common law is the property of the people and not of the government, that it's a system open to the individual seeking redress, not an instrument of state control.
Yeah. Another thing you write about is the importance of the nation state to secure freedom and representative government. Why is the nation state so important?
Well, look around the world, right? Look at the huge movements of people in the late 20th century and early 21st century. They are overwhelmingly coming from places where there isn't a nation state to places where there is. It's an almost miraculous thing that we take for granted, that you have and that we have, but that a relatively small number of countries in the world have, that we have enough in common one with another that even when we've voted for the party that lost the election, even when we're governed by people who we might intensely dislike, it doesn't occur to us to challenge their legitimacy. Now, that's very, very unusual. What's happening in Syria or in Ukraine or in Iraq is much more common. It's a much more normal condition for humanity. But the nation state allows us to have this trust, this bond with strangers. And this is, of course, an incredibly politically incorrect thing to say at the moment. The ruling ideology of Europe is that the national principle is violent, dangerous, arbitrary, and old-fashioned.
Yes.
But actually, patriotism is what makes us pay taxes to support strangers. It's what makes us obey laws, even when we don't agree with those laws. It's what makes us recognize an obligation to the people around us. It's why we react to losing an election without demanding secession. And those things are a necessary precondition for a functioning parliamentary system. I don't say that they are sufficient, but you find me a place in the world where they don't exist, where there is a basic argument about whether you want to belong to the country at all, and where democracy has been made successful.
Yeah, these things in historical terms that you talk about makes British history different from the rest of Europe, but couldn't you also say that it makes the present United Kingdom different from the European Union?
Well, to some extent, yes. I think, obviously we had the advantage of island geography, which meant that there was a very clear definition of where the nation-state began and ended, although we only really became an island nation when the English and Scottish peoples developed a common outlook and a common sense of nationality. And by the way, that was the moment of our takeoff. It was the dismantling of the last land frontier in 1707 that coincided with our ascendancy. But actually, I trace the roots of constitutional liberty back to very early origins. There was an extraordinary text that is now very, very rarely read, but was huge in the 18th and early 19th centuries, where Tacitus wrote about the German tribes who lived on the other side of the Rhine. And he was writing for, of course, a Roman audience in the 1st century, and he said, here are kings whose authority depends on the ability to persuade, not on any kind of divine right. And the law belongs to the tribe, and there are these outdoor tribal meetings to decide what needs to happen, and power is lent to the ruler contingently on behalf of the people. Now, Tacitus fell hugely out of fashion in the 1930s after the Nazi madness. Nobody wanted to claim any kinship with Germans at that stage. And indeed, Germans themselves were turning their backs on all the historical figures that the Nazis had rehabilitated. However, no one's really proved that he was wrong. What we see around Europe after the fall of the Roman Empire is a number of these Germanic kingdoms operating on precisely the kind of principles that Tacitus was describing 3 or 4 centuries earlier. We have parliaments which adjudicate taxation and which decide on succession and which also rule on important legal cases. And this was happening in Gothic kingdoms, in Vandal kingdoms, Frankish, Saxon, and so on. What's interesting is actually that it died out in most places because kings become powerful and aristocrats become powerful, and they rig the rules so that their kids benefit over everybody else's. And really from the sort of 9th and 10th centuries, in most European countries, that tradition was lost. In France and Germany and Italy and so on, it was lost. It survived on a few islands. It's no coincidence that the oldest parliaments in the world are on islands, in Iceland, Faroes, Isle of Man, and so on. It survived also in a slightly different form in Switzerland, which was like an island because it was so isolated by its mountain geography. And elements of it, I think you could say, survived in Scandinavia. But in the bulk of Europe, it was lost, and I think that's fundamentally the big difference. And we see that difference in a whole bunch of cultural assumptions, differences in attitude to the state and the citizen, taxation, and so on.
Very interesting. In your book you also talk about Winston Churchill, and he obviously was a patriot and a conservative. Still, there is one quote from Churchill that proponents of the European Union loves to mention, and that is when Churchill talks about the need for a United States of Europe. So my question is, when Churchill talked about a United States of Europe, did he really have the European Union in mind?
Well, he went on, and they never quote this bit, to make clear that Britain wouldn't be part of it. Okay. That phrase comes from the speech he gave in Zurich in 1946. And he said, let me astonish you. I'm going to say something that will astonish you. I want a United States of Europe, which will unite France and Germany. But he then went on to say, looking on as friends and sponsors will be the United Kingdom, the United States, and maybe even one day Russia, if they overcome this Soviet madness. So he had in mind a regional bloc in Europe. Now, the Swiss actually were listening. They said, okay, we can be a friend and sponsor to this thing. We can trade and we can prosper, but we don't have to surrender our system of direct democracy. We don't have to surrender our independence. And can anyone now doubt that the Swiss have got this pretty well right? I mean, Switzerland, according to the United Nations, is the best country in the world to be born, followed by Norway. Spot the connection here.
Yeah.
It ought to be possible to have free trade and intergovernmental cooperation with the European Union, as the EFTA countries do, without accepting a superior legal system to your own. Now, I very much hope that the United Kingdom will be able to get that kind of relationship. In any scenario, Europe is important. There are friends, there are customers, there are allies. Yeah. So whatever deal we have, I want us to remain on good terms. But I would like us to step back and have a much looser relationship where we are in the free market but outside the political union. And I suspect that if we could set that precedent, there would be a number of other countries that would be interested in a similar deal, possibly including some of the other existing member states.
Yeah. Two more questions. In your book, one of your main themes is the Anglosfären. What is the Anglosfären, and why is it important enough to write a book about?
So it's the community of free English-speaking nations. It's the common law and English-speaking societies which have tended to have a particular emphasis on personal freedom, sanctity of property, and parliamentary rule. The Anglosphere can work anywhere. It's why Bermuda isn't Haiti. It's why Hong Kong isn't China, or at least so far. It's why Singapore isn't Indonesia. I'm developing the interesting adjunct to this idea, though, that there may be a kind of unofficial Anglosphere developing among countries which are not formally English-speaking, but who have, in their political, philosophical, and intellectual life, become English-speaking, and who are therefore part of this wider cultural sphere. So I would put, for example, Israel in that context. It's a common law country. Although it's not English-speaking, its intellectual life is largely Anglophone now. I think you could make a case for the Netherlands being in that category, also for Norway and Denmark. Sweden, a little bit. You'll know more about this than I do. I mean, that's your call, not mine. Maybe a little bit more continental, a little bit less maritime in its outlook. But the trend, definitely in some of these societies, towards becoming culturally part of the same conversation that the English-speaking peoples have, I think that's bound to have some knock-on implications.
Very interesting. Now my final question. If the British people eventually get a referendum and vote to leave the European Union, would the Anglosfären be an alternative?
Yes, I think we would, in a very specific way, look to create a complete free trade area among the English-speaking peoples with an element of free movement of labor. We already have a military alliance. We already have close cultural links. It's the economic links that are lagging behind, and we're not able to realize our potential. We've been, in a way, cut off from our economic hinterland because of the common external tariff, because of the EU's trade policies, which are artificially redirecting our trade towards the only continent on the planet that is shrinking.
Yeah, okay. Well, all right. That's it. Thanks a lot for taking time. You've written an excellent book, and it was really good talking to you again. So thank you.
Thank you. Always a pleasure.
Yes,
Bye.
Thanks. Bye-bye. Det var alltså mitt samtal med Daniel Hannan om hans bok Inventing Freedom, en bok som varmt rekommenderas eftersom den tar upp en aspekt av historien som vi i resten av Europa i stor utsträckning har ignorerat till förmån för en tro på EU och den historieskrivning som följt i EUs fotspår. Jag håller med Daniel Hannan i ens kritik av den Europeiska Unionen. EU är ingen progressiv kraft i Europa, utan en organisation som förvisso med välvilliga motiv likväl för in Europas nationer i en ny form av det klassiska överstatliga förmynderi som i olika skepnader historiskt nästan alltid har präglat den europeiska kontinenten. Europas nationer idag står därför inför ett viktigt vägval om vi vill röra oss mot London eller mot Berlin, mot en nation som varit mer demokratiskt stabil och frihetspräglad än någon annan nation i Europa och som också har lagt grunden för hela den fredliga och fria världsordning vi idag åtnjuter, eller om vi vill styra skutan mot tyska federalistprinciper applicerade på en kontinental nivå där staten verkligen står över de enskilda unionsstaterna. Det är beslut som Europa idag står inför och i debatten därom är Daniel Hannans böcker ytterst relevanta. Med det sagt avrundar vi för denna gång, men i sammanhanget rekommenderas alltså även podd 23 där Daniel Hannan också intervjuas, podd 26 där den brittiske historikern Kit Love intervjuas om situationen i Europa direkt efter andra världskriget, samt podd 8 där jag jämför skillnaderna mellan USA och den Europeiska Unionen. Det var allt för den här gången. Vi hörs igen framöver. Hej så länge.